Today I want to talk to you about the power of diplomacy, a matter of life and death. Diplomacy is lacking in today's world. I think that's probably the major problem, a lot underneath that, but we're going to unpack that. I believe that this is due in great part to a misplaced faith and understanding of God and his character. But today I'm going to show you, this very short episode, what happens when biblical diplomacy is ignored. So let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stevie Garofalo. Reason for Truth. Truth comes first. Reasons come last. We're always and constantly learning. When we stop learning, we stop teaching. Really stop teaching, well, don't want any of that. The definition of diplomacy, according to the Britannica.com, is the established method of influencing the decisions and behavior of foreign governments and people through dialogue, negotiation, and other measures short of a war or violence. Makes sense. Modern diplomatic practices are a product of the post-Renaissance European state system, by the way. Many of you probably didn't know that by the 20th century, the diplomatic practices pioneered in Europe had been adapted throughout the world. And those practices were based on Judeo-Christian values. Everything is based on some kind of values. You take away one set of values, there's no such thing as a neutral, like secularism is not a religion, or that you're fooling yourself, or that secularism doesn't have its own set of values. Secularism just doesn't like Christian values because it ties itself to God and they want to be detached from that so they can do what they want. The Merriam-Webster dictionary, on the other hand, defines diplomacy as the art and practice of conducting negotiations between nations. I think that's the okie doke answer, as my buddy James says. It's like the okie doke. Yeah, here's a good answer. Yeah, it makes sense. Kind of like the obvious. Anyways, kind of walking into a room with an elephant going, there's a big animal in here. Well, it's the obvious, all right? Upon its inception, the United Nations Charter ideal was written understandably to foster global citizenship on the basis of, believe it or not, Judeo-Christian values. When these Christian values are ignored or tossed out, though, and many people don't know that, another set of values are implemented. Namely, I would say in today's world, Islamic, atheistic values, or maybe even Hinduistic values. And when the UN now has strayed from their Judeo-Christian values, and they find themselves lacking diplomacy. That's why there's a lot more authoritarianism going on. But what happens when true diplomacy breaks down? Well, when the true diplomacy breaks down, so does personal freedoms. And when freedom breaks down, tyranny takes over. And as a result, eventually the most talented, successful, and productive people in society, they leave. They leave where? Their town, maybe their state, maybe their company, even maybe in many cases we're seeing their home country, or a place where do they go? Well, to a place they get treated best. Why? Because they can. The better way to ask this is, why would they stay? Most people don't realize 40% of American citizens qualify for dual citizenship. That's another discussion. You can go back and look at some other videos we've done. When a corporation or a country doesn't really appreciate or reward the efforts of their best employees, that term comes back to haunt them. People leave. People are often motivated or fueled, by the way, by both justice and injustice. I'll explain that. Losing someone's job unjustly, like being fired because you make too much money. Just had a friend that happened to. That's not good. Infidelity of a friend or maybe your mate, your husband and wife. This could be a boyfriend or girlfriend or right spouse, married husband and wife. Well, how about a company that fired you simply just to save money, as we just said? Then there's those who plain simply feel that their country has deserted them or civil organization has betrayed them. When this happens, for right or wrong, people become bitter and concerned. We see a lot of this in the United States. As a result, they may leave for a place that they never would have gone to otherwise, good or bad. We see a lot of countries that, 10, 20, 30 years ago would have been considered like, really? What do you live in the middle of the jungle? They're developing now. Why? Because people are leaving the developed places like United States, Australia, and parts of Europe to do that. To borrow a phrase from Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist, great YouTube channel, People go, where do they go? Where they're treated best. As of 2016, the U.S. government reported that over 500,000, this is 2016, 500,000 citizens at that time, at least, lived outside the United States while collecting Social Security. According to an article entitled How Many Americans Live Abroad by Doris L. Spear, she's AARO president, published November 2023 at AARON.org. Spear writes that the U.S. State Department estimates that between 5.1 and 9 million, that's a lot of people, Americans now live abroad. Many to escape the political and economic pressure of a country in flux. Some people, it's inflation and cost of living, war, social unrest, the list goes on. I would assert that since the U.S. Census Bureau reported 500,000 living abroad in 2016, that number is way off. I think that number is probably 9 million plus in 2023, 2024 we're in now. Far more than 9, it has to be far more than 9 million people living abroad in from the outside the United States. Biblically speaking, the nomadic movement, by the way, due to societal unrest and all the things we just talked about, suppressive government policies, it's common for them to be nomadic and leave their homeland. Many people in the world will go where they're treated best. As we talked about nomad capitalists. Sadly, some will stay until they're basically diminished, worn down mentally, spiritually, and financially. And the key, and that's sad, the key is opportunity, timing, and circumstances. And there's no better place for us to gain wisdom and insight, by the way, on this whole subject than what? The Bible, the Scriptures. And I want to do that again today through King David, before he was officially the king, in 1 Samuel. As I stated above, people leaving their home is nothing new, as we see in 1 Samuel chapter 27, which outlines David's persecution. He's continually hunted down, unjustly, by the way, by Saul. The story peaks in chapter 27 with Saul trying to murder David many times, twice out in the wilderness. And how many times did he try to nail him with a spear to the wall, right? And for what other reason? Then David was just doing his job. David never threatened him. He just basically was jealous of David, Saul was. He felt like it threatened his authority, which is not the case. David is proven, by the way, to be innocent in the fact that he passed up those 2 occasions to kill Saul. But even after these 2 opportunities where David gave, basically grace on Saul, didn't kill him when he could have, even in self-defense, I think there was a strong case there. David told Saul outright that he was not seeking to harm and pleaded Saul to stop trying to kill him. And in the end, David had no other option to do what? To leave. He had nomadically had a pickup, didn't want to. Pretty much the only place he can go to was his enemies, by the way. Every other place Saul would have gotten him. He had like one option. Israel, he was not an option. If he would have gone there, he would have been murdered by Saul for sure. But David rightly and wisely left. He was a patriotic, godly man. He was righteous, right, in the face of God. He was a man after God's own heart. He had 2 options: stay and be killed after being chased around for God knows how long, or go to their enemy. That's one place David's not going to get him, to go to the Philistines. How many times had David been at war with them? Remember the 4 skids story? Yeah, like 200 Philistines. I'm sure they remember that. David still had the guts to go to the Philistines, who he had been successfully at war with for many years. But let's read a short intro, starting at chapter 7. David flees to the Philistines, 27. Then David says in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose, went over, he and his 600 men who were with him, to Achish, to the son of Maach, king of Gath. So what's happening here? First of all, verse 1, David placed no trust or confidence in Saul's blessings, smartly, because he was right. Chapter 26, verse 25, pushing him to finally seek refuge from Saul outside Israelite territory. Secondly, verse 2, David returns to Achish, king of Gath, 21, verses 10 to 15, who is, as the Philistine leader, welcomed David, no doubt having heard of his split with David. He probably said, "Hey, David and Saul are at war. We'll take David. He's a great fighting man, because he joins with his 600 able fighting men. That was going to be a big coup for the Philistines to get 6 basically special ops. These guys were tough, man. They were living in the wilderness. They knew how to fight. Why? Because they had to. That was number 2. 3, verses 3 to 4 says, and when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, no longer sought him. Left David alone. The most widely accepted site of Gath today, by the way, is believed to be about 12 miles east of Ashdod, or about 24 miles west of Jerusalem. David went, to give you some geography, David went to Achish at Gath, and Achish delivered David from the immediate danger of Saul, right? Providing him an opportunity to further develop his leadership and military skills. Verses 8 to 12 talk about that. David's time in Philistine territory, by the way, also gave David knowledge of the region he didn't have before. Being there, living there, doing whatever, practicing war, doing all the things he did. But for today's lesson, a result of David's leaving his home country of Israel puts an end to Saul's pursuit of him. That's the bottom line. Going back to the opening article, AARO consulted with Mr. Hector David Pinto, an electrical engineer working at U.S. Government Research Laboratory near Washington, D.C. Been there before myself, used to sell into that particular agency. Mr. Pinto made a deep analysis and recently estimated that over 4,835,864 U.S. citizens live overseas in total. And I would think that number is probably a low number. That's probably what's reported on some level. Maybe the Census Bureau, I'm not certain everybody fills that number out. But he says the top most popular countries for expats are Mexico, Canada. Mexico has over 1,089,368,000. Canada, just under 1 million. United Kingdom, 371,000 and some change. Israel, 243, almost 244,000. Germany, just under 200,000. Australia, about 190,000. South Korea, 120,000. Italy, there you go. We're on the, baby. 94,941. France, 94,473. And Japan comes in at 87,967. The article goes on to say that living overseas can be very difficult for many Americans at first for numerous reasons, ranging from setting up bank accounts is very difficult, cultural differences, language differences, and then there's the income variance, right? Some people are on a fixed income with Social Security, other people have a business and they're very wealthy. It also boils down to one's desire and their ability to merge in a new culture. And if you don't want to merge with the new culture, you're most likely going to end up same confined boat you left in the first place. So there are people who go to another country that they just stay in their house all the time. Man, what's the good of that? The age of a person also plays a role in it. Young people, they tend to get out and experience culture a lot more than older people. In 1 Samuel 27, David was understandably fearful of Saul. He was under a lot of pressure when he fled from Saul. Chapter 20, David now had his wives, his children, all the families of his men. He had his men and their wives and their children. A lot of pressure for David to move ahead and show some results and protect them. But this begs the question as to the importance of diplomacy in today's world. See, when leaders become dictators, diplomacy fails. The end result of failed diplomacy is that your best people leave you. They go where? Where they're treated best. When your most talented people leave one state for another, one company for another, one country for another. That body of people, that talent pool, we see this in California, their wealth leave. California's lost some of their most wealthiest people, and they've gone other, and then you see places like Miami, Florida, they pretty much took them all in. Yeah, they've got all this wealth and talent of people. The lack of diplomacy willfully ejects their most productive, any country's most productive members of society, and that's sad. When diplomacy breaks down, people end up being treated unfairly. When people are treated unfairly, they leave. And when they leave, they create a starving state, depraving the state of its most productive, needed, talented citizens. And as a result, not only to do the best leave, but the worst stay and the bad come where they're treated best. We see this in California. Why do they go there? The climate's good and California accommodates them. Places like Texas, a lot of times homeless end up leaving there. They themselves go back to California. Why? Because California takes care of them. It just gives them free house, free food, free phone, everything. And you see this again playing out in the big cities. Listen, enough of that. In conclusion, diplomacy must rest on some form of religious value. I submit that Christian values are the only values that seek the good of all the people. And we saw this. We see this with Saul and David, right? Saul could have, whether he loved him or not, if he would have exercised and deployed good diplomacy, Judeo-Christian diplomacy, this would have been a whole nother story in the Bible. Things would have been much different. At the end, David still would have been king, but Saul would have kept his couth, wouldn't have been murdered, I doubt, in war. He probably would have lived a good old life, and he would have been gone out with his reputation and his legacy good, not bad. Listen, even Hindu people, wonderful people from India, they have their own values. Muslim people, okay? But, they have their own values. But even in India, they have unclean, they have the caste system. So if you want to use their system, you better hope that you're not poor or that you're, if you're business class, you're at the top. The Shudras, the unclean, they're at the bottom. So you see the same thing playing out there. Indian people are awesome. I'm just telling you that's the way their culture works. Islam, you know how that works. Atheism, well, that's a whole nother deal. If you're a Muslim, non-Muslims are seen as the infidel. In many cases, in countries, they actually have a legal term for being taxed. So many foreign and more Islamic countries, many times, they'll actually institute a tax. They'll just tax you. Why? Because you're not a Muslim, like the Muslim tax. Atheism is the central religious system behind communism and authoritative rule. With atheism, it's all about the survival of the fittest and it rewards the most powerful and the wealthy. That's their value system. You could see you're their vassals, just as if you were in the caste system in India. The best way to achieve real diplomacy and be fair to all human beings equally is through the Judeo-Christian ethic and moral value system. That's why the United States has been leading the world for about 100 years, okay? In the end, selfish ambition, lust, greed, unchecked power has led to a lack of diplomacy. That's what happens when diplomacy is ignored. It breaks down. So let's pray that people get back to the ways of God, study what happened to David, look at that as a good model for us in our own culture. Diplomacy is lacking in today's world because our faith in God in many cases is lacking or it's misplaced. We can easily change that if we earnestly seek God, His value system through the Bible, if we take it more seriously, and each morning we seek His face deeply before we start that day. Listen, the choice is ours. If we as Christians will really stand up, get out of our recreation and our comfort, we can turn this thing around. Doesn't mean we're not going to have massive repercussions, that the culture is really not going to decay in many ways, but we can turn it around for our kids' generations. That's all I'll say about it. Let's make sure we're diplomatic with our friends, our family. Let's make sure we're tolerant of other people, that we love other people, and that we don't say things that we can't take back. All right. That's all I'm saying about her. God's blessings to you. As I said earlier in other videos, make sure you check out a few things. You want to go get some online training, certificate courses, equippedacademy.com. Make sure you give the right hook, Italian, bam, Gonzalo Sinistro, bah, knock out that subscribe button, alert bell. We'll see you at the next video. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.